education's my background. I was briefly a school teacher, very briefly, because I wasn't very good at teaching maths, so I gave that up. And that's such a long time ago now. But it, just in terms of putting, me in my background, that's what it is. It's squarely education. But I have been interested in educational space, which not all people in education are, or they have to be reminded that they are interested in space. But it's been my particular interest now for 20 years, 2 whole decades. I have been, boring people about educational space. Okay, so I was invited to come and give a talk, and it's always very difficult. In some ways it's easier when someone says, right, I want you to come and say this, this and this, whereas this was like, well, could you come and give a talk? And you think, well, okay, what shall I do? So I thought, trying to sort of boil down lots of the conversations that I've had over the years, and particularly recently, and trying to make it relevant to the context here in the Nordic countries, where there are different schools being built. There's no doubt about it. There's some new spaces. So hence my title, New School Spaces for 21st Century Education. But then trying to step back from oh, that's a lovely new school. That's very exciting. Although it always is. And thinking, what does the research evidence suggest about the design and use of buildings for education in the 21st century? Okay, so I've just got half an hour. I'm just going to cover all that you need to know about research evidence, design, use, and the whole of the 21st century, which we're only, less than a quarter of the way into. Okay, I promise much. Okay, so what should education be like in the 21st century? So there's been quite a lot of talk, certainly in education circles, but also in sort of international sort of governmental circles, about what 21st century skills should be. And I think that's partly, you get a new millennium, so people, or for new century, and people are like, oh, we should be doing things differently. So I just, that's a recent quote that the European Commission, last year just referred just like that to 21st century skills, as though we all knew what that was. And they put in brackets communication, creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, etc., which I thought was quite interesting. So I did a little bit of tracing, looking back at what people had said over the last, say, sort of 20 years about what we meant by this. And I thought the OECD in 2011 talked about effective learning is constructive, self-regulated, situated, collaborative. And they tried to get this whole CSSC learning going. I don't think that really caught on in quite the same way as 21st century learning, though, because I hadn't heard of it. And this goes back, though, to the European Union proposing 8 key competencies in 2006. And these are quite interesting because, as they acknowledged, the first 3 are fairly obvious. Communication in mother tongue, communication in foreign language. The English didn't get that particular memo, clearly, but anyway, competence in math, science and technology. So much so obvious. But then digital competence, learning to learn, social and civic competence, sense of initiative and entrepreneurship, and cultural awareness and expression. So this idea, and the last 5 of those are considered to be transversal, so they go through everything. And a few years ago, my colleague in Newcastle, David Leet, Professor David Leet, has spent his life thinking about innovation in curriculum, not in space, but in curriculum. And a lot of how I've been thinking about innovation and change has been influenced by his talk on curriculum, and the two are obviously linked. So in this publication, which again is over 10 years old now, he notes the paradigm shift being proposed, and he read lots of these documents at the time, explodes conventional understandings of school learning. Certainly the rhetoric is very different. And he says, this demands a very different conception of schooling. If you take this thing seriously, if you actually follow this whole 21st century learning through, you are thinking about a very different sort of schooling. So that, of course, then begs the question, where should this different schooling be happening? Should it be happening somewhere like that, conventional, everyone face it, or somewhere more like that? Okay, so first thing anyone in education's wondering, possibly you're not if you've got an architecture background, because you think, well, yeah, obviously the space matters. If you're coming from an education background, quite often your immediate reaction is, well, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe we can do education anywhere. And yeah, there's some truth to that. So I'm just going to have one slide on the evidence. Right. This is, in a nutshell, my 20 years of trying to work out what is the evidence for the impact of school space. So, yeah, your takeaway message, and you're probably aware of this, that there are positive correlations between quality of space and quality of learning. And, yeah, however, if you've got some measure of quality of space and some measure of quality of learning, if you correlate the two, they are broadly positive. And there's lots of particularly American work was very good on this, because they like crunching numbers. And it's okay, so far so good. Of course, there are lots of positive correlations in schools. There's also, happy teachers, happy students, high achieving students, nice buildings, they all tend to come together. So where does the correlation get us? And what the takeaway message, and this is one of the things I'm always saying to teachers particularly, is there are a few direct impacts on learning, but they're generally about poor environment. So generally too noisy, too hot, terrible air quality. And I know, there's been problems with air quality, indoor air quality in the Nordic countries. If you get those bad enough, they actually directly impair learning, but they have to be pretty bad. It has to be pretty noisy. It has to be very hot or very cold. So broadly, if you get things broadly okay, you're not going to get direct impacts on learning. But that doesn't mean you don't get indirect impacts. And so there's many more indirect impacts. So, and to start with, that's disappointing, because people want direct ones. They want to think, well, if we paint the walls yellow, everyone will learn better. Well, yeah. Sadly not. Or it would all be so much easier. But those indirect impacts are actually really interesting, because then it starts to become important what you do in the space. And this is a really powerful message for teachers, that it's what you do with the space. Once it's broadly okay, that what you do with it is really important. And actually, this shouldn't have been any surprise to anybody, because that's what reviews of the evidence over 50 years have been telling us. So I always put up Weinstein. She did an excellent review. If you want a good review of the evidence for the impact of school space on learning, read Weinstein from 1979. And she points out that it's the use of the space. Higgins et al., that was the review I was involved with, but I wasn't the main author, which is really great, because it means I can put it up there and no one realizes I'm citing myself. Handy. And Blackmore, that was a review done for the Australians, for Victoria, state of Victoria. And they all, so it's the use that matters. Okay, so school settings, which includes the stuff you've got there, the design of the space, the organisation, the furniture, all that sort of thing. They facilitate some things, some pedagogical and social practices, while hindering others. And that's your takeaway message. And it must be true, because me and Paola say so. But so does lot. And I mean, in terms of, the references, they're some of my favourite references. There's lots of people you could reference showing that. Okay, so in a nutshell, get the basic physical features right: temperature, air quality, light, acoustics. Then consider what you actually want to do with the space. Okay. What do you want it to do? So what does this mean for schools? So this is my slide that's particularly, if I'm talking to teachers, I often have what does this mean for teachers? What does this? And so one message is the school space matters, but there's no single ideal design, because if there was, we'd have found it by now, and we'd have, none of us be here. We'd be, I don't know, we'd be having dinner or something. Who knows? So there's no single ideal design. And then there's this effect that, it's what you do with it that matters. And therefore, the teacher becomes so important. And, much as I said, people in education can overlook the space, teachers do understand space. They might not talk about it. They might not initially be able to explicitly say what they understand about the space, but in their day-to-day work, they will be using it, and they will know what it can do and what it can't do. And if you get talking to a teacher, they very quickly tell you what's wrong with their space. So they do have to continually work out and sort of negotiate those affordances. And I'll come back to affordances in a minute. And because of that importance of what you do with the space can be part of change. So you see where I'm getting back to the whole, if we were really going to do 21st century learning and do it very different from what we've done before, then, we're probably right to think in terms of innovative spaces, because space can be part of the change. Okay, so that's good, isn't it? We just build some different spaces and it all changes. So that's great. Unfortunately, though, change is really problematic in education. So that quote there is from Mark Priestley, who David Leap put me onto, who's done a lot of work on curriculum change, particularly looking at curriculum in Scotland, where they've been sort of developing their curriculum quite separate from England. Anyway, and I just like this, in a nutshell. Change does occur in schools, albeit often slow and incremental, trivial and superficial, unsustained, and with a high incidence of unintended consequences. So if you want a sort of what's wrong with change in schools, we know it happens. Change happens in both practice and policy in education, but not always coordinated. And school environments have changed over time. So my image over there is a classic sort of 19th century English school. And then the other images, apart from that one, which is from Iceland, just because it looks nice there. The others are recent builds in England. They have changed. We have to acknowledge that, particularly in terms of toilets. But okay. And sometimes educational innovation is reflected in the physical space. Sometimes. But the takeaway message here is change in education is known to be challenging for all sorts. And everyone in education knows that, whether you're talking practice or policy, change is difficult. So now I'm going to sort of talk about two examples of where we really did try to do some things differently in England. Okay, so the promise of educational change through changing the space. So most recently, a mere 2 decades ago, we had Building Schools for the Future, which you're probably aware of. You're aware of the sort of... So this was explicitly about transforming education. Quite a lot of money was spent on new schools, but the idea was that each school would be quite individually designed, and it'd be for that particular school and looking very much to the future. This was obviously early days of the century. Okay, so that happened 2 decades ago. Going back further, in the 1960s in England, we got very excited about progressive pedagogy, much more sort of child-centered learning, and that the sort of spaces that could help that sort of child-centered learning. So there was this big report done in 1967 advocating this new style of learning, certainly for primary schools. So that's our age 4 or 5 through to age 11. That's our primary age group. And so they're supposed to be doing lots of child-centered exploratory learning, and that's the sort of design that could help. So that's your classic open plan. Finmere School, credited with being the first open plan school, designed and opened 1959. So I could talk about that for quite a while. Actually, it's quite interesting. So, okay, what happened when we tried to do change through changing the space? Or partly through changing the space. So this was a school that tried quite explicitly to change. They were being rebuilt through Building Schools for the Future, BSF, and the school leadership really wanted to use that new building to make bigger changes about how they went about their learning. So there was lots of changes they were trying to make. Part of that was a new school building. They had a really good plan for how they were going to do this. They were going to start with developing sort of inquiry-based learning. They were going to reorganize the departments into 5 cross-disciplinary faculties, and then they were going to move into this new school, and it was going to be marvelous. And I was involved with the experimental week where the teachers sort of tried out ways of doing project-based learning. Everybody had a lovely time, but unfortunately not much of that was taken through to the new building for various reasons. With my colleagues, we wrote an article about this saying, oh, it all went wrong. And this is what we said, in the 2 years following our research, the school came under increasing pressure from external forces. Ofsted, so that's the National Inspectorate in England, who can be very critical, and it's very public if your school is seen to be failing through Ofsted. So Ofsted is really scary. And they were really critical, and they were critical of the design of the space, and it all went wrong. And in fact, I didn't find this out till later when I did a bit more research into this. By 2013, the school principal was replaced and walls were built. So it all went wrong. Yeah. It's very sad. It was really sad. So what happened about the educational change of the 1960s and 70s? Well, we got lots of open plan design. So by the 1970s, virtually all our primary schools were being built to this sort of open design. Yes, all provide space and equipment for frequently changing patterns of work, the sort of stuff. Everybody's doing things differently. It's all going to be that's a photograph taken from a pamphlet that was produced by a school as it moved into its new building in 1970. And that's how it's supposed to be. Everybody's moving. It's all very flexible and child-centered, except that it wasn't always. So Ian Cooper, who's actually an architect by background, who did a doctorate in which he published as sociology of education, looked at, well, how are these spaces actually being used? And he said, rather than display, basically the children were rather static because the teachers were maintaining control. And in lots of ways, things didn't really change. Through the 1970s and 80s, we had increasing criticism of these sorts of designs, including from the National Union of Teachers, representing their members who were struggling with these designs. And there was growing awareness of open plan space being used inappropriately for traditional teacher-centered practices. And everybody gave up, built a load of walls, and we went back to enclosed classrooms. So that's a bit depressing. So here we are, the innovative learning environment, everybody. So, I'm sure you know this. This term has been used various places, has been used particularly by the OECD, but also in New Zealand explicitly there, although they've moved away from it recently. So referring to this wider ecosystem of social practice and physical property. So that's the New Zealand definition. And of course, worldwide, schools are being built with this more open and flexible design, most evident in the Nordic countries, and also Australia and New Zealand, but here and there in other places. And as we saw through Building Schools for the Future, well, briefly in England, although we've moved away from that a bit. Okay, so given what I've just said about what could possibly go wrong and how can we avoid it going wrong? I think that's the thing. I mean, we could stand here all day telling horror stories about spaces that don't quite work for people, but that's such, how can we avoid that? So what went or goes wrong and how can we avoid it is my key thing. Okay. So there's no doubt about it. These sorts of designs do offer opportunities for doing things differently, but they also they're challenging. If you've got used to, as a teacher, put your children in the room, you shut the door, and you do your own thing to your own timing without having to worry about what any other adults are doing. To move from that to working with other teachers and timetable, it's really different. And that's not just going to happen just like that. And, you know, all sorts of people are writing about this, particularly from Australia and the Nordic countries. And there is a tendency to revert back because, as Gislason says, I'll come to the model in a minute, the standard classroom model is deeply rooted in history. Everyone understands what a classroom is. And it supports traditional teaching really well. If you want to stand at the front and tell people things, then a traditional classroom, you know, teacher-centered from the front, it works really quite well. And just because you replace your traditional blackboard with a projector screen, you still stand at the front and you tell people things, and it works well for that. There's also a bit of an international thing going on here as well. Certainly when we got quite excited in England with building schools for the future, we were quite often looking overseas and saying, you know, I want one like that. I want one like they've got in Denmark. Yeah. And we often looked to the Nordic countries, less to Australia, which is interesting, given that they've got loads of interesting buildings. But the trouble, you know, there is this trouble with borrowing. We all know that borrowing between countries in education can go wrong. There's lots of examples of that in curriculum and sort of pedagogical ideas and similar designs. And I think this is an interesting one. The sort of over enthusiasm for innovation from some often quite loud people can cause the misgivings of others to be overlooked. And that was the takeaway message that Cooper came up with from the 1970s. And it's certainly what we found again in that school, that because there were people who were really excited by this new building, and however much we tried to say to the school leadership, you're really excited, and you're right, it is quite exciting, but there's quite a lot of teachers who are really not very happy. And they went, that'll be fine, it'll be fine. And I think that's for me, was a real takeaway message. So how do you understand these problems and try to avoid them? I think the two things I found very useful is thinking about alignment of the sort of all the different things that go together to make the total educational environment, which is the space, but also the other things, and thinking about affordances, which is a recent thing. And you're probably, some of you with architecture backgrounds are better on affordances than I am and have more of a nuanced idea, but here goes, hey. So lots of different frameworks have been developed to consider the sort of elements that contribute to the learning environment, which is Gislason's phrase, and Carvalho, Goodman, Yeoman in Australia, they've talked about this sort of emergent learning activity. So this is basically aligning design and use, but perhaps thinking particularly what that means in education. So Gislason talks about the physical stuff, the material stuff, but then organizational stuff. And that is huge in education. So actually, your curriculum and your timetabling and all that organizational stuff, which happens at school level, local level, national level, international level. And then you've got the students, what they're used to, the dynamics of that, and the staff culture within the school. Meanwhile, Goodyear and everyone, they've got this slightly different framework, but there's obvious sort of parallels. So they think in terms of the setting, the physical stuff, the task you've sort of set people to do, and then the social side of things. So this is more moment by moment learning, whereas Gislason is more the whole setup over time. But you can see sort of similarities. So it's this idea that the physical environment matters, but so do these other aspects, and you have to align them. Otherwise, if you have mismatches, it all goes wrong. And that's basically what was happening with the open plan space being not used as intended. So you're trying to cohere rather than conflict. Meanwhile, affordances, so this is this sort of idea of what the space can do, and that's a product not just of the space, but of the user and the space. So it's something about how the user understands the space. And what Young and Cleveland do in this article, if you haven't read this, it's really worth reading. They talk about affordances. But they also make the point that it's not just about individual affordances, it's about collective sort of understandings of what a space can do. And particularly in the context of a school, the sort of professional understanding that a group of teachers can develop together, which particularly if you're hoping that they might do more collaborative work together, that makes a lot of sense to me. So it's not just about, so back to what went wrong with some of the open plan of the sort of 1960s and 70s, there was a tendency to blame teachers. Oh, that teacher was rubbish, they didn't keep up. But maybe it was more that they didn't collectively as a profession or as a group in a school develop that sort of collective understanding of what the space could do. Okay. Enough theory, in practice. I'm not going to talk you through this. If you haven't read this article by Anna-Christine and Torvi in Iceland, you should do so. It's really good. So this was a school that they worked with the school when they were sort of designing, and it was designed in a very sort of collaborative way between the school, the local community, and the architect. And they came up with quite an innovative design, which, yeah, looks quite different to what they'd had previously. And inside, it's quite, it's that open, flexible design. Broadly, this is the conclusion that Anna-Christine and Torvi draw. Main conclusion is that this, the collaborative design produced that progressive model of a school, which didn't just, wasn't just about the building, but it also led to a different practice, which has established and sustained. Although they do point out it's a little bit of resistance. There's bits where it doesn't work quite so well. It's particularly the teachers of older students, the subject specialists, often weren't so happy working in this more flexible way. I also give you more recent 21st century schools. That's 21st century schools in Iceland, very innovative. More recent 21st century schools in England, we have moved back from our transforming agenda of building schools for the future. So the priority school building programme replaced BSF because we had a change of government, and it was a very political decision. They stopped building schools for the future because it was very much associated with the previous government. So we had priority school building programme, which was still building schools, but with very different design process and the products. So whereas before it was all about participation by the school community, now that was specifically excluded. We had, whereas before it was supposed to be about individualized design, now there was baseline designs that had to be adapted, and they were intended. There was a lot of rhetoric about being functional, not expensive, not wasting money. And so we reverted back to something that was much more traditional, tried and tested, and very sort of, as you can see, enclosed classrooms. I mean, it wasn't as if we had loads of open space with building schools for the future, but there'd been a bit of experimenting, and that just went with the priority school building programme. So instead of participatory design, transforming education, we have this idea of providing just, efficient provision of standardised conventional settings for current practice. So we're no longer looking to the future, we're designing for the current. And I followed a school through a rebuild under priority school building programme. You don't really need to know much about it. I've got the details on the slide. If you want to read about it, you can. The premises were a bit old. They were a bit worn. A bit of a mixture of funny blocks of different ages. And they got a new building. So we followed them through. There's their new building. You can see it is quite functional because it is the priority school building programme. You're not allowed any curvy bits. And there they are, making it their own. And modern toilets. This is what we took forward from the building schools of the future to the priority school building programme, was the toilets. And what did they think? They really liked it. It's really nice, it's really clean and new. Excellent spaces. The teachers moved in very easily because they had conventional enclosed classrooms, which is what they were used to. And in fairness, we have quite a traditional, certainly for secondary school, our curriculum is very traditional. We have a lot of, it's all subject-based, it's individual assessment, which is quite high stakes at age of 16. So actually this works really well. Yeah, conventional design, the affordances of a traditional school, and aligned practices. Everybody's happy. Yeah. Okay, so, right, what can we conclude? And you're thinking, I've spent 20 years getting confused. I wanted to share it with you. Okay, so what I think you can take away from this, my takeaways. Yeah, I think flexible, more open learning spaces, undoubtedly there are really exciting things you could do with those sorts of spaces, but they do have challenges which enclosed classrooms don't. The evidence base doesn't rule them out or make them inevitable. So I think now at the moment there's a bit of an argument beginning to happen in New Zealand where, people are starting to point to the evidence and saying, where's your evidence for this open plan space? Well, I don't think, my reading of the evidence is it doesn't rule out open plan flexible spaces, but it equally doesn't make them inevitable. And I think, but what the evidence really shows is that need to align the sort of design and use, that, there's no point in building new spaces and trying to use them in an old way. And I think this is something that lots of people do overlook. Change requires an enormous amount of effort. So everything and everyone has to be committed to that sustained change. And that's not just about the teachers, the practice, it's about the policy. And I think that's often forgotten. There's a tendency to blame the teachers. They didn't know how to use these spaces, rather than thinking about the bigger stuff that teachers are working within. And there's no doubt about it, in England, that the high stakes, individualized exams at 16, that puts a lot of pressure on. So nobody's thinking, oh, let's do lots of really interesting stuff with our 15-year-olds. No, they're thinking, and the children are as well. The students say things like, yeah, but we've got these exams. we need to sit and be told things. So, yeah, so it's a bigger context than just the teachers. But for those of you in the audience who are architects, last little thought on the politics of innovative school design. Cooper said, 40 years ago, those who seek to influence education, albeit by seeking buildings designed to facilitate preferred patterns of use, are involved in politics. They're involved in attempting to shape or reform the future. So he was particularly critical of architects at the time saying, well, we're just responding to what educators are doing. And I think he was very critical of that. He thought, no, they were trying to push for a particular view. And more recently, group of researchers working in the Australian context, so very much that open, flexible, sort of push towards open, flexible space. The work of educators is a political project that is inherently affiliated with organisations associated with global economic interests. As innovative learning environments are an OECD initiative, certainly they're modern modern guise. They reflect the interests of a global economic movement. So that's who you're reflecting. Right. And if we share these slides, I have got loads of references. So if there's anything you think, wow. Yeah, it's really when you just start thinking, oh, what can I put in that will back this up? They didn't get me here for the decisiveness or the decision. I just yes. Right. So, and discuss.